When we were thinking about speakers for our next topic, the auto industry's next chapter, we didn't have a long list to choose from.
In fact, there's only one option. Please welcome Steve Greenfield of Automotive Ventures.
How's everyone? Good? I don't know about one option, but I know that 90 days ago, where's Nathan? He reaches out, not this Nathan. Well, you're a good Nathan too. All Nathans just stand up. So he reaches out and says, hey, do you want to be on the main stage on Thursday? And I'm like, yeah, sure. What do you want me to talk about? He says, well, why don't you tell us who's going to win and who's going to lose in the next 5 years? I'm like, well, that's like kind of loading me up for disappointment for the audience. So I did have some time to think through the presentation today. I guess a couple of housekeeping things. One, I will always have too much content for the time that they give me. So I am well caffeinated, and I'm going to speak quickly today, and we won't have time for questions, but if you've got questions in the app, after I get off stage, I'll read those questions and try to be thoughtful with responses. I hope to provoke some thought here. You may not agree with everything. That's actually what I'm trying to accomplish, is really to think through who's going to win, who's not going to win in the future. And maybe most importantly, if you'd like a copy of this presentation, maybe wait to the end to see how I do. I'm happy to send you a copy of the presentation. So let's get started. So this is one of my favorite quotes from a futurist who I respect. The future's already here. It's not evenly distributed. So remember this quote, because my very last slide, I'm going to come back to this. The point here is that if we're still and we observe, we can see the seeds of the future because they are all around us. And you'll see evidence of that throughout the presentation today. So I am ambitious as usual. We've got 11 sections to go through in 43 minutes. So we're going to go through this very, very quickly. But there's a lot of content to go through. But one thing I thought about, and I added this in yesterday, I was like, let me score this so we can all track, and then I can hold myself accountable. And we're going to talk about who's going to win, who's going to lose. I'm going to look at this for the benefit of the audience through the dealer's perspective. And then as we go through all 11 sections today, why don't we score each of these sections in terms of whether they're a good tailwind for dealers, it's a headwind for dealers, or it's neutral. And you may or may not agree with me, but I'm going to take my best stab at that. And at the very end, we can review this. And maybe next year, I can get up on stage and say, how did we do? How are we tracking? So, the dealership model. I have a couple of slides here from Aaron Kerrigan, who I respect a lot, who publishes a lot of data on dealers. So, what you're looking at here is a slide from a year ago. Now, the caveat, this is only for the public groups, but the height of the vertical bar, the blue bar, is the pre-tax profit per dealer location for all the public groups. So you saw this interesting dynamic happen from 2019 to 2022, where profitability per location tripled. It was great, good time. Something like 90% of all cars that year sold above MSRP. Front-end grosses were good, back-end grosses were good, fixed operations was great. And so you'll see things in the press, like we saw just earlier this week with the Presidio's publication, that yes, profitability year over year is down 24%, but we're still much higher than pre-COVID. So the question is, will we get back to pre-COVID profitability or not? And you might not like the answer that I'm going to give you, but I think that based on historical data, we can look at what trends might be. At the same time, again, from Aaron Kerrigan, we looked at total profitability. Total gross profit per new car sold is the height of the vertical bars. As you would expect, 2022 was a record year, probably of all time. The light blue bar was the volume of new vehicles sitting on dealers' lots. So if you rewind and go back to 2019, pre-COVID, folks in the industry were lamenting that, man, we're at 4 million new cars. We have way too many new cars on dealers' lots. We didn't know COVID was going to strike and have supply chain issues. But we got down to like under 800,000 new cars sitting on dealers' lots, which created this supply-demand dynamic, right? So as part of this today, we will talk about tariffs. But the good thing, this is so recently emblazed upon dealers' memories, that we can kind of anticipate how tariffs might play out in terms of new cars and used cars for certain brands. And then I like the screen's really big. Even people in the back row can read this. So this is out of Automotive News here, thanks to Stone Eagle, just a week or two ago. They looked at profitability, front-end gross, back-end gross, total gross. The key things that I'm pointing out in red here, look at the front-end gross pre-COVID. We're almost back to the same front-end grosses. It was a nice ride while it lasted in 2022, if only that we could maintain those forever. But look at this, back-end grosses are still significantly higher. So as a dealer, I'd be saying like, okay, look, I don't have a lot of control over what front-end grosses are, right? Especially with tariffs, and if my automaker happens to be Nissan with crummy product right now, I might not be able to get much front-end gross, for example. Sorry, Nissan. But what comes around goes around. All automakers go through that. But I would be thinking about what are the controllables? What departments within the dealership can I control? I can control back-end gross much more than front-end gross, and how do I hold on to that gross enhancement that we experienced during COVID? So, this is from Glenn Mercer. Hopefully you subscribe to his work. If you don't, highly recommended. He's a good friend. This is going back 50 years. What you're looking at is the same thing I showed you 2 slides ago from Aaron Kerrigan. This is net profitability before tax. That's that blue line. For 50 years, and if you look at a trend, never once in 50 years has the average dealer in America made a loss before tax. Pretty amazing. Shows the durability of the business model. A lot has changed in 50 years, and we'll get to that, but the durability of the business model. Glenn's thesis is this, it's actually been in a fairly narrow band, except COVID. So just like with mutual funds, historical performance is not necessarily an indicator of future performance. You have to look and say, what has systemically changed for us to believe that we won't get back to 2.5% gross profit? And this is obviously the tyranny of the averages. There'll be a lot of dealers with different brands and different geographies that do better. There'll be a lot of dealers that do worse. But on average, it's very interesting to see how eerily stable pre-tax profit has been for dealers over 50 years. And you can guess where we're going to go in the future, but I would suspect that if history's any indicator, we'll get back to effectively operating within this band. However, having said that, if we went back 50 years, I was very young. I wasn't in dealerships back then. But for those that were operating dealers, it's funny, I was up presenting to dealers at the Michigan Auto Dealers Association, and there were folks in that room yesterday who were selling cars 50 years ago. I would imagine that you mostly focused on one department, which was new cars, and how much profitability you were making on new cars. In fact, used cars and trade-ins might have been an annoyance back then. Well, look at the business model innovation that has occurred over 50 years. Now, more than 50% of a dealer's profitability comes from parts and service. F&I, as we just saw, is a controllable department where you can drive a lot of significant profitability for a dealership. And the question is, for folks like me who are investing in startups, is, what might this look like in another 50 years? Because there will be more departments that emerge, but you can really start to think through what other innovation still has to happen, and what will a dealer's business model be? The head of the Michigan Auto Dealers Association yesterday said, dealers are in the business of providing mobility solutions to consumers, not necessarily selling cars. And I think it's very interesting that you can abstract yourself and say, what role should dealers play in the future? What departments will develop if you're thinking about yourself as a mobility provider, not just a seller of vehicles? And then Glenn says, of course, based on leading the subject here, that he suspects that in the next 10 years, probably we will operate within that band of 2 to 2.5%. Okay, so the dealer model, I think it's been under attack since I started in the industry 25 years ago. It's proven to be very durable. History shows it's very durable. Folks that know, like Glenn, say it's durable. I'm going to give that a nice, strong green check mark that I don't think dealers are going anywhere, which will be reinforced with my next section, which is about OEM direct selling. So, section 2, So during COVID, there was this interest for OEMs to move towards what they called an agency model, where they were going to take more control of the inventory, the marketing, and the relationship with the consumer. Well, that has almost all died now because, as you saw, new car inventories come back. And the last thing an automaker wants to do is take the inventory risk that usually gets pushed upon the dealer and incur all the depreciation risk and the cost of carrying that capital. But we still see these things happening. Scout, which is under Volkswagen, and the Volkswagen dealers are not very pleased that they're going to launch a new hot product and attempt to sell it directly to consumers. We see California recently has pushed back and taken them to court. And the same thing is playing out right now with the joint venture between Honda and Sony bringing this car, the Afeela, to market. And it's going to be an all-electric vehicle, but a lot of the electronics powered by Sony. And they're going to build it in America, in Ohio, but they're going to attempt to sell it directly to consumers and not let the dealers sell these vehicles. So any Volkswagen dealers in the audience and Honda, I'm probably giving you the chills right now. But this is a hot topic with NADA right now and the state associations, et cetera. I don't think either of these are going to succeed. As we saw recently around the world, the dealer model has proven itself to be the model to deliver vehicles. Tesla is the one exception. Rivian, I believe, if I had to project, Rivian 2 years from now won't be a standalone company. And this will probably be in Automotive News or something now, but won't be a standalone company. The brand's strong, the product's awesome, but it cannot. You look at the losses, they can only incur these losses for so long. They're losing $30,000 per car sold. At some point, that brand should belong under a larger OEM, offering it as a product, and it'll go back and be sold through dealers going forward. So I think that not only from Section 1 is the dealer business model durable, I think it's very defensible, and I think there will be folks that try to sell directly. But I think inevitably they will come back to figuring out that the best way to retail and service vehicles and consumers is through the dealer model. And that will resonate when I get to the China section as well. So OEM direct selling, I don't think it's a threat to dealers. I think, yes, there'll be noise, there'll be Scout, there'll be Honda, Sony, and there'll be others, but I don't think long-term we need to be worried about OEM direct selling. Electrification, which a few years ago was everyone's favorite topic, not so much anymore, perhaps. So if you look at long-term consultants, they've been pretty unwavering that long-term, this is 2050, for penetration in America, EVs will become the dominant drivetrain. Where we are right now is this noisy intermediary step, especially if tax incentives become repealed, is like, what is natural demand for pure EVs right now in America without tax incentives? Well, actually very, very little. Because you think of EV sales, which are 8 or 9% of all new car sales, half of those are Teslas. And if you take the Teslas out, there isn't a lot of organic demand without tax incentives overall. However, I think, why is it that consumers aren't buying EVs today? The truth is, it's these three things: range, charging speed, and charger availability. When 1 in 5 chargers in America doesn't work, consumers literally are playing Russian roulette every time they roll up to a charger. And then range is always an anxiety, but it's coupled with these two other things. If charging speed was almost instantaneous and there were chargers available, would people really worry about range? So I think these things are interconnected and will collapse with better battery chemistry. So we've seen recently out of China in the last month and a half, 2 different companies, BYD and CATL, the largest automaker, and the largest EV manufacturer in the world now, and the largest battery manufacturer separately, both announced new solid-state technology that will permit a battery to be charged to full charge in 5 minutes. And this is going to be dependent upon having fast charging infrastructure, back to the charging infrastructure issue. But I would maintain that when the battery chemistry becomes so good that you can charge a car as quickly as you can fill it up with gas, and we move away from the concept of plugging a car in, and we use inductive charging, just like you do with your iPhone, you put it on the cradle, and while it's on the cradle, it's charging. You'll be charging everywhere. right? You park here at the casino, and some of the charging spots will have inductive plates under the asphalt, and your car will just be charged when you come out. Charging will become an afterthought, the range will become much longer, and charging will become quick. At that point, people will be able to actually factor in the total cost of ownership of EVs that don't need a lot of maintenance. And it's like, on balance, why would I have a gas car? So I believe these forecasts are correct. I think we've got a lot of pain in the short term. You may not agree with me, but if you agree there's any chance that EVs are the dominant drivetrain in the future, it'll segue nicely into my conversation about China, because you might be a little bit more concerned with China than you are today. So I think electrification is a net neutral. If consumers decide to adopt the technology, dealers are the channel through which they'll be sold and serviced. If consumers are slower to adopt the technology, dealers still don't have anything to worry about, because they'll just sell ICE cars and hybrids in the interim. This is the most dangerous section because it changes literally like day to day right now, hour to hour. But let me have a go at talking about tariffs in two buckets. So this will be a segue to talk about China. Maybe the one thing that Biden and Trump agreed on were imposing 100% import tariffs on Chinese OEMs, automakers. We'll get to China, and I have a section on China. But these tariffs that we're wrestling with now, that are a moving target, are challenging for a number of reasons. And I swiped a few slides from the New York Auto Forum, I hope J.D. Power doesn't mind, with attribution, that I thought were very eye-opening. I want to share those with you because I think it provides maybe a different perspective and a little bit different context around what might happen. But no matter what, prices in some cases are going to go up for the consumer, which is not a good thing when we're selling cars. And as a result of prices going up, volumes will go down. So we've had this great sort of like couple of months of pent-up demand, consumers cluing in, buying cars ahead of tariffs. But over the course of the year, depending on what happens with tariffs, we could see a softness of overall for the whole year of 1 million to 2 million new cars overall. So just get prepared for that. Now, the slides from J.D. Power I thought were very interesting. So hopefully everybody can see this. So these are the 30 brands sold in the US, and this is what the effective tariff rate is going to imply in terms of pricing for the 30 brands. We can imply some things. You might know better than me. I assume that little guy number A over here is Tesla. Things are assembled here in the US, very few parts are imported. So very little impact to Trump's best buddy, Elon. Over here are manufacturers that import all of their cars. So this would be, for example, Subaru. In the middle, we have these averages. But again, back to the tyranny of the averages, wait till you get your head around what I'll show you next. So here's one brand, happens to be a large Japanese brand, but not disclosed. And these are their different SKUs, their different models. Some of these models are built in Japan and imported. Those are going to get the full tariff. Some are built on American soil and are going to get almost no tariff. So imagine you're a salesperson now, in a month or so, trying to talk to a consumer who comes into your Japanese import automaker, high-volume automaker, and says, how do you make sense of this? The salesperson is going to have a hard time explaining to the consumer, why some of the cars that last week or last month were 25% less expensive are higher, yet other ones had hardly a bump whatsoever. And then it gets worse. If you look at a segment, this is the mid-size SUV segment, which I think is the highest volume segment in America. So you've got some competitors within the same segment that are going to have a 25% price increase potentially, and some that are going to have effectively none. So here's a consumer who's cross-shopping vehicles within this high-volume SUV segment, and they come into your dealership, they're like, well, I don't really understand why your car is so much more expensive than the one that I'm cross-shopping. So none of this, the takeaway for me is, none of this is good for the consumer because it's going to confuse the heck out of them. How on earth are we going to arm our salespeople to be able to explain these differences? And for the time being, at least, not to give away too much, but this Japanese automaker just announced that they're going to absorb $2 billion worth of, the incentives for the next 2 months. They can't do that indefinitely. I think the good thing from all this is that I haven't heard anyone say that the dealers are going to have to absorb any difference in margin. You are going to have to deal with difference in pricing. MSRPs for some vehicles will go up, and you have to explain it to the consumer. But no one seems to be implying that the dealers are going to absorb the margin. It's either going to be absorbed by the consumer with higher prices or by the OEMs just absorbing the tariffs, hoping that they go away sometime soon. And then there's obviously the complexity of trying to account for all this stuff. This was an example out of the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago that showed a piston from the raw aluminum to the finally putting this into a vehicle, how many times it crosses over the Canadian, US, and Mexican borders, and are you really gonna be able to calculate on a part-by-part basis the tariffs given these parts are moving back and forth so frequently? So it's going to become very, very confusing to be able to audit for tier one suppliers and OEMs and even figure out what the right tariffs are. So I think tariffs for the time being are neutral. I'm hopeful that by the end of the year they've gone away entirely and they're simply a negotiation tactic. Not everybody in the industry agrees with that philosophy, but I think from the dealer's perspective, other than the pain of having to bring the consumer along for the journey and explain to them, I don't know that there's going to be an immediate impact on dealers' margins, and therefore I have it at neutral. Okay, great. China. If you haven't been paying attention to China, I'm willing to bet that after my few slides here, you will be, and you should be. So China has the benefit, whether you like the way that they govern or not, they have the benefit of looking at problems on 100-year cycles or 1,000-year cycles. Whereas in the US, we're in this dysfunctional 4 years at best, 2 years usually, the pendulum more radically swinging back and forth because of the political system here. But China does distinctively feel that they want to be the global superpower and that they will just continue through continuous pressure, apply pressure to get there. So China, 15, 20 years ago, they decided that they wanted energy independence. China does not extract oil or gas from China. They're a net importer. And they said, how are we going to get energy independence? We're going to get independence around wind, solar, and electrification. So they decided to start locking up ownership of mining around the world, refining, and then key components. And then you see companies like BYD arise. You know, Warren Buffett invested in that company 15 years ago before it was producing vehicles. It was an electronics manufacturer. And now BYD has just become the largest EV manufacturer in the world. So if you dismissed what I said earlier and you think there's no probability whatsoever that EVs are the dominant drivetrain anytime in the future, then you really wouldn't worry about this dynamic. But that's a lot of red controlling a lot of the world's supply chain around EVs. And it's not good when you've got geopolitical tensions with another superpower that wants to dominate the world, controlling that much of the supply chain. 25 years ago, the Chinese in the red line had almost 0% market share of new car sales on the face of the earth. They're now at 40%. There's only one line that's going up to the right. Everybody else is going down to the right. And there are even more dysfunctional dynamics going on here that we should be paying attention to. Now China's up to about 24 million new car sales per year, but their capacity is 45 million. So the difference is excess capacity, and we know what happens when there's excess capacity. The profit margins get driven out, which they are. None of these 157 automakers in China are making any profit. And there's a relentless pressure to go find homes for these cars. So they're exporting very aggressively around the world, into any country, anywhere that doesn't have tariffs. And they're finding that they're much more profitable when they ship these cars into international markets because of the drastic overproduction at home. And this line is only going up to the right. So let's talk about why this is a problem. So there are folks in the world that their whole business is to rip apart these cars and inspect these cars and try to figure out what's their cost of production, what are they doing with the supply chain. This is a BYD seal. BYD is this Chinese company that Warren Buffett invested in, with a comparable vehicle, a Volkswagen made in Germany electric vehicle. These numbers show by component how much cheaper the Chinese vehicles are. So they figured out ways to drive cost out of the production of vehicles. So whereas 4 years ago, the domestic automakers were looking at Tesla and saying, how on earth is Tesla generating more operating margin? Now they also are looking at the Chinese manufacturers and saying, what have they learned that we haven't, that we need to learn from a manufacturing standpoint, because their costs are dramatically less for vehicles, but it gets worse. So if you look at the average Chinese vehicle is at about 70% of the cost to produce versus the legacy automakers. Even more problematic is this, a legacy automaker, from a concept car to getting that car into your showrooms to be able to retail to consumers is typically about 4 years. With the Chinese, that's about 9 months. So they get 5 learning cycles, Darwinian evolution cycles, in the same time that a legacy automaker gets 1 cycle. So not only are their costs less, but they're producing cars and they're learning at a faster rate. They're learning. You hear about LeBron James or Michael Jordan putting in more hours in training. Well, the Chinese are getting 5x the amount of training to grow into bigger, stronger, more healthy OEMs overall. So this is very problematic, but you might say, well, it doesn't really matter because we got tariffs here in the US. We're going to protect the legacy automakers. Well, I would maintain the tariffs are short-term band-aids. The legacy automakers need to figure out how they're going to compete vis-a-vis the Chinese. Many folks in the industry believe it's only a year or 2 before the Chinese automakers will be permitted into the country. So we'll talk about that and the implications as well as we wrap the Chinese section. But it's interesting that it's been 10 years now since Sergio Marchionne from FCA published his Confessions of a Capital Junkie. If you want a copy, I'll send it to you. You can also look it up online. You can find the PDF of his presentation. But interesting thesis he had, if you remember this, and it wasn't very popular at the time, but he said, look, he showed 2 pie charts and said, the average consumer only really differentiates cars around about 20% of the content. 80% to them is undifferentiated. So why aren't we sharing costs and sharing platforms under the surface with these vehicles and only focus on competing around the 20% of features that consumers actually believe are differentiated, right? So his motion then was to say there should be pretty dramatic consolidation of brands because we can share platforms globally, save a lot of cost on the back end. The overall industry should be more profitable. We've got too many brands, and consumers don't perceive too much of a difference between them. So I believe that in reaction to these dynamics with China, the automakers, as we saw already, I mean, Nissan is a troubled brand. With all due respect to Nissan dealers in here, the brand's troubled. It's going to end up somewhere, right? It may end up back with Honda. Right now there's cultural issues. But I think you're going to see more of this because the automakers naturally will say, well, the easiest thing here is let's combine and try to bring costs out. And in my 25 years, I haven't seen one merger work. Many have been tried. Maybe somebody else in the audience knows of 1 or 2. So I think this is, and there are always cultural issues with automakers, like dramatic cultural issues that end up sort of like sabotaging whatever the theoretical benefits of these things are. Michael Dunn, if you don't subscribe, well, if you're interested in China, this is probably the best subject matter expert I have found on China, Michael Dunn. He puts out a newsletter every week or so. He did some work recently for the European Union, which has been feeling the Chinese kind of invade that market. And his proposal here, I'll summarize this for you, is just turn the tables on what the Chinese did in China 20 years ago. Allow them to come in, build plants, employ locals, but do it under JVs, so the legacy automakers benefit financially, but also force them to share intellectual property. Everything they know about manufacturing, lower costs, everything they know about batteries has to be shared. So there'll be intellectual property transfer back to legacy automakers overall. This is probably the best hypothesis I've heard, and I suspect this will play out. I suspect, and I'll go out on a limb here, but sometime during Trump's presidency, he will be negotiating JVs with Chinese automakers to build plants in the US, probably structuring joint ventures with legacy automakers, and we will start to see Chinese brands on American soil, which I think is a good thing for consumers because they're cheap and high quality, filling that affordability gap that we've got right now in America. But it'll be very interesting to see how that's navigated. My point for everybody here is this. Maybe this is the most important thing. And when I was in front of like 90 dealership principals yesterday up in Michigan, I literally got a blank stare when I said this, but Michigan is a different breed. Well, it is because some of these dealers say like 80% of the cars that I sell are going to employees and employee programs up there, right? So it's very different up in that market. But if you were, and I'm sure that many people in this room have felt this and lived through this, right? But if you were in 1957 and you saw this Japanese brand coming into the US, the immediate reaction is like, those cars aren't going to sell in the US. We're not going to want those cars. Well, tell JM family that, right? Gulf State Toyota. 69 was the first Honda that came into the US, I'm sure. Could you imagine this? I mean, in 69, they were building these beautiful, big, high horsepower muscle cars in the US, and this thing comes in? I mean, dealers really had to have a leap of faith to say, I'm gonna put my hand up and be the first Honda dealer in my local city. And then obviously we saw Hyundai, which had really, really bad cars, like really, really bad cars. Those first ones, like I was in Toronto and I remember in 1984, the Hyundai Pony came out. And by the end of the first winter, there were holes in the side of them from rust. I mean, it was like just a really bad car. But look where we are now, right? If you had been one of the early Hyundai dealerships, which I'm sure there are some in this room, now you're saying, wow, it's a really, really good brand. So I think I would just encourage us in the room to be very open-minded. The Chinese are not, to my point earlier, they're not going to come in and sell direct to consumers. They're going to need dealers like you. Be open-minded. Get in and drive these cars. They're super high quality now. The price point's amazing what they can build. And be the first in your market to put your hand up for these Chinese brands. And if you don't, that's okay, but I would highly encourage it. So I think China is a threat. It's a threat to your OEM. Your OEMs are going to be less healthy because they're going to be under attack by these Chinese. And when the OEMs aren't as healthy, we see what happens. They're going to permit you to make less money on the front end of the vehicle, maybe not be able to invest in R&D to have the best quality product, et cetera. So the OEMs are under attack. This is the number one thing being discussed in the boardrooms of all legacy automakers right now. Dealers need to pay attention. And I think that you're going to hear a lot more about China going forward. The good thing is, I think, is if you're nimble and opportunistic, you may very well benefit from the Chinese eventually soon getting into the US. Okay, connected car, I'm going to commingle this with fixed operations. So this is according to Cox data showing loyalty, service loyalty back to franchise dealers. Back in the 60s, it was almost half. Now we're lucky to get 30% of service work for franchise dealers overall. And why is that? Just more competition, right? A lot of the private equity firms have invested in folks like Jiffy Lube and Driven Brands, et cetera. There's just more competition, especially at the end of the warranty period. 2 slides from Bank of America showing just that the aftermarket is huge, right? These are hundreds of billions of dollars in the aftermarket, and it's growing quite nicely. But the franchise dealer share is the dark blue bar, especially as vehicles get older. We almost get no market share of this aftermarket service work at all. And the hypothesis is the connected car may dramatically change that, which I think is good. Another slide from Bank of America showing that dealers capture about $1 trillion in maintenance work, and from that deliver about $55 billion in profitability. And the rest of the industry, the non-franchise dealer, captures about the same amount of revenue, but has higher profitability from that because they don't have all the overhead of managing the operations you manage, the franchise dealerships. This is opportunity if we can move more of this profit, revenue and profit, up to franchise dealers, and the connected car uniquely provides this opportunity. And the reason is the cars are going to be able to diagnose what's wrong with them, and then recommend who gets the work. So this integration, which is coming, is going to drive much more loyalty back to a consumer who otherwise might go to a Jiffy Lube, might go to another tire shop. The car itself should be recommending, you need to get this work done. Here are dealers in your local market. Hopefully they allow the dealer who sold the vehicle to the consumer to get first crack at this, and effectively even map them back. So I think there's this great opportunity as the cars become more technology sophisticated to drive more loyalty back and deliver more fixed operations for dealers overall. So I think the connected car is a great thing, which should drive more loyalty back specifically for fixed ops. And then let's transition to fixed ops. As the cars become more complex, this is data from one of our portfolio companies, WarCloud, which shows that at the end of the warranty period, typically the average dealer loses about 70% of that work to the aftermarket, as we just saw with the Bank of America data. And there will be national right to repair acts. I don't think we have to be fearful of those. So the Jiffy Lube is going to be able to get the telematics data off the car. They're going to be able to get the schematics and the build data from the vehicle. But I would maintain it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter because the OEMs can look at other technology companies and say, how do we effectively build a walled garden around the vehicle and make it really, really hard for someone to go use an independent repair shop versus drive the work back to the franchise dealer. I have a way overpriced $1,300 iPhone, and the first place I think of to go get this thing serviced is the Apple store. I don't think about using an independent repair shop. Apple has been very conscious about building this walled garden around their business, and I think the OEMs will also be able to encourage the consumer to take a technology product, which is a car, and come back to your stores, franchise dealers, to get them serviced. So I think the combination of these two things, the fact that the technology is going to get so advanced that the average technician at a Jiffy Lube isn't going to be equipped to be able to work on these things, coupled with the connected car effectively diagnosing in real time and then guiding them back to your stores, I think dealers will be busier than ever in fixed operations, which gives them another green check. So far, so good here. I'm maybe a little bit behind, but we'll speed it up. Collision repair, according to NADA, 1/3 of franchise dealers run associated collision repair shops. What we've seen is inflation, which largely was the reason that Trump beat Biden and Kamala Harris, because consumers were in mainstream America were feeling, increases in what they were paying for goods during the election. Inflation was up from the beginning of COVID by 20%. Vehicle collision repair was up 50%. We had a shortage of technicians, supply chain impacted it, availability, et cetera. There's something worse going on, and I've never worked for an OEM, so I don't really understand how OEMs think about the complexity of the car being built on the production line versus repairability afterwards. And this maybe has me more worried than anything else right now in the presentation. This was in 2023. This Rivian gets this fender bender. The consumer gets the car back in 9 months, and it's a $42,000 repair bill. How on earth does this happen? Well, again, maybe someone can help me with this, but this is the dynamic that's playing out in real time. And remember, put this in the context of now the automakers are saying, I have to relentlessly take costs out of the production of the cars because I'm fighting with Tesla and I'm fighting with the Chinese. So this is a Tesla Model 3. Previous generation had 150 components in the frame. You hear this term gigacasting or megacasting. Now we're down to 3 components in the frame. So when I was working at Manheim 20 years ago, I used to watch these guys. They were like artisans, these body repair guys. They'd pull off a quarter panel from a unibody construction. They'd fix it. They'd put the car back on the road. Well, there's no such thing anymore, right? When the frame is one piece, and apparently Elon Musk collected Hot Wheels cars as a kid, so took inspiration from this. Like, why don't we cast the entire frame in one piece? Now, there aren't any parts to remove, to fix. If you get a tear or a bend in this frame, the car is effectively becoming close to being disposable. This is maybe not a great example, but supercar on the left, suspension component on the right. As we let AI design the components in the car to take out weight, build torsional rigidity, these kinds of things. I mean, I don't know what it would cost to get that part replaced, but that's not the kind of part that your average O'Reilly Auto Part or Advanced Auto Parts is going to be stocking. It's going to be very expensive to repair these cars. An example of this is a Tesla air conditioning manifold. This is all one piece of aluminum. Yeah, if you looked at legacy automakers, they might have 20 parts, any of which you could go pick up from O'Reilly's. Well, not any longer. There's a $3,800 part, so if you get a bend or a tear in this unit, you're replacing the entire part. Is Tesla really concerned about repairability of the cars afterwards? Not so much. There are implications increasing the cost of repair costs. But even for legacy automakers, here's a Toyota Camry, right, which I think recently was the highest selling vehicle in America. We went from one model year change, from a 2017 to 2018. The number of parts in the bumper assembly, front bumper assembly, doubled. The cost of those parts doubled as well. So what happens if you look at the difference, one model year difference, you get into a front end impact, and the cost to repair that vehicle is 26% higher. How do you explain that to the insurance companies? How do you explain that to somebody who owns this new fancy Toyota Camry when it's getting very, very expensive to repair these cars? So what's happened as a result, insurance costs, vehicle insurance costs have really started to skyrocket. And this is a big concern for me because I don't hear from a lot of dealers that like consumers come in and they start with, hey, can I afford the insurance on this car? Usually they find the car they like. Dealers don't want to talk about insurance because they don't want to add friction to the conversation. Let them go home and figure out later if they can get the thing insured. My problem is this. I think that with this, the toothpaste is out of the tube. We've got this China threat, this Tesla threat. The OEMs have to drive costs out of the production of cars by building $3,800 single pieces of aluminum in these vehicles, and I worry about this. Frankly. There are now insurers that are telling you, hey, it's time to renew your insurance. We don't cover homes in your area any longer. Is this going to play out for auto soon? Because insurance providers are going to say, like, for certain models, it's like, this doesn't make sense anymore. Either I have to increase your insurance by 300%, or I just stop carrying certain vehicles. And we do not, as an industry, want this dynamic to play out. But I think we're on the cusp of that potentially soon. So I think collision repair and the implications on affordability insurance are big. Okay, so I'm going to move through here. Customer preference is a short section. So many times in history, the dealers are going to be driven out of business by disruptors, right? In the early days of the internet, we now have Amazon Autos, and with all due respect, if there are Amazon people here, they're just not making much progress with this initiative. They're finding that it's really, really, really complex. And that's why, despite the fact we've had quote-unquote disruptors like Carvana, who has risen from the ashes again, I mean, the vast predominance of vehicles are being transacted in your stores face-to-face, and that's not going to change. If we had these catalyzing events, most recently COVID, where if we were going to make a wholesale move to digital retailing and driveway delivery, it would have happened. I don't know. No dealers call me now and say, hey, I'm considering a new digital retailing tool. When's the last time you bought a digital retailing tool? It's just not happening because you're not worried about it anymore, because the best thing is to give the consumer what they need, but know and have peace that they're going to come into your dealership to negotiate. So you may not get this quote if you weren't a fan of 80s British pop, hint, hint, but I just think that if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. All right, cool. So consumer preference, I don't worry about dealers getting disintermediated. And then maybe notably, given the current traction of autonomous vehicles, this slide is from Morgan Stanley back in 2012. And they said by now, 100% of all new cars would be fully autonomous. Consumers would no longer own cars. It would all be ride-hailing. This is from Morgan Stanley, right? Eerily, this slide I'm going to show you is from February this year, from Goldman Sachs. And they're saying, now, it's a little bit of a cheat because they do say levels 3, 4, and 5. Level 4 and 5 are full autonomy, like go to sleep in the back seat sort of autonomy. 3 is very minimal human intervention. But they are looking at fairly dramatic penetration here within most of our lifetimes for fully autonomous vehicles, right? So it's very interesting. We see what the progress that Waymo is making. It's a shame where Cruise ended up, but the progress that Waymo's making is very interesting. You know, Waymo announced this week they're adding 2,000 more vehicles. They're mapping Atlanta, where I live right now. So I'm excited that we're going to have like driverless Waymos driving around Atlanta. But they're adding cities very, very quickly, and they're starting to test cities that have more challenging weather, like Boston, as well, to see how these things are going to perform in the winter. I don't on purpose have anything about Tesla saying that they're going to do robo-taxis in June in Austin, because that's not going to happen, but we'll leave that for another topic. But I think that Waymo is interesting to watch, also because Uber is structuring partnerships with all of the autonomous vehicle providers, including Waymo. And on the last earnings call, Uber's CEO said that the robo-taxis in Austin are busier than 99% of regular Uber drivers, right? So these things can, like machines, they just can operate 24/7. All you have to do is make sure the car is charged, and they can just keep operating. So they will be able to, over time, drive dramatic cost out of operating per mile, which is pretty interesting to see. This slide I swiped from Morningstar. I think the main one to think about is, if we start to get traction around autonomous vehicles, how does it disrupt different areas of the economy? Most notably, auto insurance. If the cars never get in an accident, maybe we don't have to worry about collision repair. Let the cars be as complex as they need to be, because the accidents effectively go to zero, and we aren't having to worry about insurance and collision repair, et cetera. And then final section here, as I wrap, is on artificial intelligence, everybody's topic du jour. I would maintain this, right? In my lifetime, there have been very few catalyzing technology events. And these are them. The question is, how catalyzing will AI be? Because no one would have expected. I remember being like an avid BlackBerry user back in 2007, and I saw this and I was like, there is no way I'm ever going to give up my keyboard. I could like walk through an airport or drive and be hitting every key with my thumb, right? I'm sure a lot of people did the same thing. And I very reluctantly gave up my BlackBerry when I only absolutely had to. But you look at these technologies, and no one at the moment would have understood the dramatic impact that these technologies would have had. And we're at the cusp of this right now. And ChatGPT seems to be like a side hobby for most of us. You know, yeah, you might like, draft your homework on it, or like, an email to a customer or something. But we haven't really started to see the potential for AI quite yet. And you might dismiss this, but I would not dismiss this. This could be a bigger catalyzing technology than any of these others, or maybe all of them combined. Just be prepared for that. Just be prepared for that. So you saw ChatGPT was the quickest technology to reach 100 million users. It took them 2 months. So there's an appetite, a voracious appetite for consumers to explore this kind of technology. What's the relevancy for dealers? I think it's really, as I think about it, and I might be too simple-minded, I've been accused of that before, but I really see it here. If this is a graphical representation of what a dealer's monthly costs are, 60% of your cost is human capital. Right? There's a great opportunity. So think back to what Glenn Mercer showed, this 2% net profit margin before tax. And is there an opportunity to unlock more profit for dealers? It's going to be from releasing some of this and dropping some of this to the bottom line. So as I look at the evolution for dealers, right, this is the framework that I use, the evolution from left to right, phase one is a co-pilot. So if you hear the earnings calls from Google or Microsoft, something like 40% to 50% of all software code by their developers is now being written by AI bots. So everyone within your dealership, within a couple of years, is going to have a co-pilot sitting on their phone, sitting on their screen, anticipating what you're trying to do and making it easier and faster for you to do those tasks, which should release repetitive monotonous tasks, but just make all of your folks smarter and faster with their existing tasks. Number two, as those co-pilots become smarter and faster and better and you train them up, now you've got agents. So now I go home on the weekend and I say, hey, would you mind doing my bidding over the weekend, follow up with these customers, populate the CRM for those calls that I took during the week that I didn't have a chance to populate, et cetera. The agents will do your bidding. Now we go from an individual employee being 20 or 40% more productive to now you have a multiplicative effect, right? So now you get the average employee who can be 5, 10 times better. So you get real multiplicative effect. You start needing fewer employees. And then at some point you clue in, you're like, well, hold on a second. If the agents are working 24/7, never calling in sick, doing a better job, my CSI's higher, do I really need all of my employees? And the light touch here is just as people attrit, as they retire, then you just don't rehire those positions. The more aggressive is you could think about your employee structure and how you can just be actively taking folks out. And then going back to the 60% of your cost, which is human capital, for every hour you take out, every person you take out, all of that flows through to your bottom line. And we start actually helping dealers print more money than the 2% net profit margin before tax. Who here has heard of vibe coding? Okay, I got like 2 hands. Next year at this time, all of you will raise your hands. All of you will raise your hands. The idea is a layperson like me can be a very effective software coder now by just talking to the machine. Hey, I want to build a game that looks like 2 paddles and a ball that moves back and forth, and they're scoring on both sides. And the computer's going to say, how does this look? I'm like, I don't like the color of it. Change the background color or whatever it is. You're literally going to be able to prompt the machine to build your software code better than any coder instantaneously. This is going to be a breakthrough for building software. The big takeaway here will be the dealers out there, if you've always wanted to build a better whatever it is, widget on your website, you'll be able to do it. There'll be no barriers to entry to building software code. And we are on the cusp of this right now. If you look this up, there's a lot of early stage companies that are getting funded right now around vibe coding. It'll be a term, you'll remember you heard it here first, because this will be a term a year from now everybody's very familiar with. So let me wrap with this. So there's a gentleman named Michael Hayes that works for NADA. Does anybody know Michael Hayes? Okay, good. Awesome. Well, there you go. Nice. So Michael's a great guy. He's been overseeing their 20 groups for 25 years. I was at the California New Car Dealer Association meeting last year. I was presenting as well. Michael was wrapping up. He asked for questions. And I said, Michael, I'm willing to bet that you have sat through 10,000 moderated 20 groups. And he said, yeah, probably something like that. So I said, okay, so help me with this. What is the one characteristic of the top performing dealers in America? And he said, like with no hesitation, he said, oh, that's easy. He says, they focus on customer lifetime value. They have no interest in maximizing profit for a deal. They look at a customer and say, how do I satisfy this consumer to make them be a customer for life? 4 years ago, I was working for TrueCar, and I had a chance to go to Longo Toyota. Who's been to Longo Toyota? Cool. Biggest Toyota store, biggest dealership in the world, sells 20,000 Toyotas a year. Greg Penske, the son of Roger Penske, is the owner, and we were out there trying to sell him TrueCar. So he was very generous with his time. Greg is a very gifted human being. If you spend time with him, you're amongst greatness. I don't know how much of that's come from Roger or it's innate, but he is like a gifted human being, and I can tell you stories from that day. But at the end of the meeting, 3 hours in, I'm going out to the parking lot to get my car, and there are people waiting to pick up their service cars. So I strike up this conversation with this guy. I was like, hey, what are you in for today? He says, just a regular oil change. So what are you driving? A Toyota Camry. I said, where are you coming from? Now, Longo is on the east side of Los Angeles, okay, just for reference. I said, where are you coming from? He says, well, I came in from San Diego today. I'm like, you came in from San Diego for an oil change at a Toyota store. I said, how far did you drive this morning? He says, well, I had to drive through rush hour, so it was an hour and a half to get here. I said, well, how long is it going to take you to get home? I don't know, like an hour, quarter. So I said, do you know you drove by probably 15 Toyota stores on the way up here this morning for an oil change? And I said, why did you do that? And he looked at me like I was an alien, like I wasn't speaking English. He says, well, what do you mean? I was like, why would you drive by 15 Toyota stores through rush hour to come up to Longo to get your oil changed? And he said, that's a good question. I never really thought of it. He says, listen, I bought my last 5 cars from Longo. My wife, my kids have bought Toyotas from here. My neighbors buy. I tell everybody about Longo. All my friends buy Toyotas from Longo. It says, I've never actually thought about why I would service anywhere else. I would never go anywhere else. Coming back to Greg, so TrueCar's business model, as you know, was to try to sell a dealer an incremental new car for $300 advertising cost. At the end of 3 hours, he kind of looked at me and my boss, the CEO, and said, you know, guys, I just don't get it. I don't get like why TrueCar would work for me. When I divide my marketing spend by the number of cars I sell, it's $75 a car sold. And I looked at Greg, I said, there is no dealer in America. There's no dealer in America that's getting away with a $75 cost per car sold from a marketing standpoint. But it shows what Longo, the machine that Longo has built, to have a guy who has bought his last 5 cars from Longo when he lives in San Diego and drives up for an oil change. It shows that there are dealers out there that are very successful, that really do live this and focus on long-term value. So there's your scorecard. I'll be accountable next year. If I'm not semi-right, you don't have to invite me back. One other observation, and I heard this recently. So I'm reading this book, Path Breakers. Great book, especially if you're investing early stage. I thought this was really interesting. This pottery wheel, this is from Mesopotamia, 5,000 BC. So you had potters, P-O-T-T-E-R-S, using a pottery wheel, horizontal, back 5,000 BC. It wasn't until 1,800 years later that someone thought, hey, if I take the same wheel and flip it vertical, can I stick it on a wagon? So back to William, you laugh, yeah, but back to William Gibson. I thought, what an interesting analog for where we are, right? Back to William Gibson, that there are all these technologies and things we're seeing outside of automotive, and we're going to look back and say, man, why were we so stupid to wait 1,800 years to apply these same practices and technologies to automotive? This is what I'm on the hunt for, entrepreneurs that are going to exploit these arbitrage opportunities. But this, I hope, if anything, resonates with you, because it really resonates with me. So with that, we will conclude. Here's my contact information. Happy to send you a copy of the presentation. If you have questions in the app, I'll get to answering them right away. So please commit those, and thanks for your time today.